So I think recording started. So let's start this, session again. Thank you, Adam, for coming and giving the session for my community here. So this time today we'll be talking about the Lightning Components 101, and we're happy that Adam is, ready to share the knowledge with our team, with our community. With that, without any further delay, I need to provide a thank you to my sponsor, which is Appirio, my company, and Cloud Vandana. Quick introduction of myself. My name is Shudipta Dev. I'm a technical architect working with Appirio, and these are my quick details. And this is my Twitter handle. With that, I'll not waste any more time. I'll stop sharing and hand it over to Adam.
Right, thanks, Aditya. So let me go ahead and share. And my internet had some issues last week. It's been good so far this week. But if I start breaking up at any point, just let me know.
Sure.
All right. So let's go ahead and get started then. So welcome everyone to this session today. Thanks again to Sudipta and the Kitchener user group for hosting. And of course, the sponsors as well. So I'm going to be talking about Lightning Components 101, an Apex developer's guide. So kind of perspective from an Apex developer on learning Lightning Components. And so a little bit about me real quick. So my name is Adam Olshansky. I'm a Salesforce engineer at Google based in Mountain View. I have over 600 Trailhead badges and 14 certifications, but I'm really passionate about helping people to learn and specifically code on the Salesforce platform. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Adam17AMO. Shoot me an email at adam@adamtoarchitect.com. Check out my blog, adamtoarchitect.com. And if you're not yet on the Lightning experience, I have a Pluralsight course that might be able to help you out, bit.ly/lightning migration. And so with that, though, so I gave this a Dreamforce, so we're going to ignore the forward-looking statement. All right. So let me talk about kind of why I wanted to put this presentation together. And so I was kind of, started off as a Java developer, got into Apex. Obviously a lot of similarities, Java and Apex. It's all back end. And I really liked it, and I kind of went off on my developer journey. And as I started, going more and more, I started kind of climbing this mountain, learning more along the way. And I started kind of hearing terms here and there that I kind of pushed off to the side. Front end, JavaScript, client side, shadow DOM, callback hell, all these kind of terms came in here and there. And I was just happy going up my developer journey as an Apex backend developer. And then I started seeing polls like this. This is a poll done by Stack Overflow from 2019. They surveyed 72,000 developers. And for the 7th year in a row, they found that JavaScript was the most commonly used programming language, followed shortly behind by HTML and CSS, some other kind of languages of the web. And there was a similar report done by GitHub that was looking at pull requests. And again, for the 7th year in a row, JavaScript was #1 in GitHub pull requests, and actually comprised 20% of all pull requests on GitHub are in JavaScript. In case you were curious, Apex is 39th in the list of languages for GitHub pull requests. So it's pretty clear that JavaScript's pretty popular. It has been pretty popular for a while. And as I was kind of ignoring all these front-end terms, kind of one day I took a look around and said, oh, I missed out on quite a bit, and I'm a little farther behind of maybe where I want to be on my developer journey. Backend's kind of been safe, but it's pretty apparent I need to get a handle of some of this front-end stuff if I really want to grow and continue my career as a developer. So that's kind of the reason why I wanted to get into this and put this talk together and help other people kind of in the same boat I am. And so my expectations for today, you're already an Apex developer, you're comfortable with Apex, probably Visualforce as well. I don't want anyone thinking they're going to be able to learn JavaScript in 40 minutes. I don't know if 40 hours is enough. But what I do want you to take away from today is start being able to understand common patterns, things that are similar with web components to what you already know. And we're going to go into some of the stuff that's new and hopefully give you confidence to stop putting off learning front end and learning components any further and start building some yourself. So that's what I'm hoping you're going to get out of today. This is really step 1 along your journey, and we're going to talk about kind of steps 2 and 3 toward the end of the session as well. All right, so agenda for today is pretty simple. We're going to do a brief overview of kind of Apex, where we've been, what you already know. We're going to talk a little bit about components. We're going to do kind of what they are. We're going to do a comparison of Visualforce versus Lightning Web Components, do a deep dive and some demos with Lightning Web Components, and then we're going to wrap things up and talk about kind of, again, step 2 and beyond. All right, so with that, let's get into an Apex overview here. This is kind of stuff we already know and we're familiar with. So Apex and Visualforce as well. All right, so for the most part, not too surprising, Apex comes in more or less 2 flavors, triggers and classes, right? Your triggers are code that's in response to some sort of database event, right? Before insert, after update, some event fires, and your trigger runs. Your classes and controllers kind of sit off to the side. They have methods, they have parameters, they have return statements. And then across both of them, we see variables that we can use throughout our code. You're also probably familiar with asynchronous Apex, right? At future annotations, we're familiar with annotating methods, batchable Apex, queuable Apex, this notion that code can process asynchronously and then will notify us when it's done. So we're kind of familiar with that concept already as well. Right, and again, Visualforce, you've worked with it before, you kind of know a little bit about how to build it. It's a button-based UI, follows the model view controller framework, uses HTML style tags, right? Apex page, Apex input, Apex page button, right? All these different tags that make up our UI. And then it talks to Apex controllers using bind variables and bind methods, right? The curly bracket bang syntax, so lets us talk to the controller from the Visualforce page. We know all that stuff. We're pretty familiar with it. You're also probably familiar with some of the gaps and kind of hacky solutions you have to put together with Apex and Visualforce, right? You're running into governor limits. You're having to do a lot of button clicks. You're having to wait while you click the button and Salesforce gets called and does its Apex processing and then sends it all the way back to you, right? So there are some performance issues potentially there. And you're probably also familiar with hacky solutions, right? You'll find some code somewhere, some JavaScript code, throw it in a script tag on your Visualforce page. Maybe you don't know what it does, but it seems to work. So you figure, all right, let's throw it in there now. Maybe it could be better, maybe not. I'll worry about it later because it's working now. And that's okay, but there has to be a better way, right? And that's kind of also kind of what Lightning Web Components are hoping to solve some of these issues. All right. So we're going to get into a new programming model here. I like to call it MVC++. You might also hear it referred to as MVCC, and we'll see why in a minute here. So we're familiar with the MVC, Apex, and Visualforce model. But first, let's talk about how we got here, right? So Salesforce launched in 1999, Dreamforce 2007. They launched Visualforce, which at the time was kind of an innovative solution. You can build UIs in Salesforce now. It's button click based. You click a button, goes to the next page. You click a button, a record gets updated, etc. And that was fine for 2007. But fast forward for today, and there's not a ton of websites that are using kind of button click UIs anymore, right? We've seen JavaScript's been king since 2013, and Salesforce wanted to respond to the needs of the users and the consumers who are wanting this more responsive UI. Right? You do something on the page and things should be automatically updating. And so they came out with Aura components using the open source Aura framework in 2015. And that was okay for a little while, but things were changing rapidly. And so last year, 2019, they came out with Lightning Web Components. And we'll talk more about why they made that decision a little bit later. But this is kind of the developer journey Salesforce has been taking. And so when Visualforce came out, things kind of looked like this. Everything is happening on Salesforce. When we talk about the server, we're talking about Salesforce, right? Your Visualforce page is on Salesforce. Your application logic and your controller is on Salesforce. And your database, your schema, right? Your fields and your objects, that's all on Salesforce. And so when you, the client in your browser, right? So your browser is what we call the client. Your browser is loading a Visualforce page. It has to make a call to Salesforce, load the UI, run the logic, check the schema, update the UI, and then send it back to your browser. And obviously, especially if you don't have a great connection, there can be some performance implications associated with that. Right, so this is where we were, everything on the server. And so we're going to change that a little bit now with components here, specifically Lightning Web Components. So we're still going to have our Salesforce server, right? We still have our database, our fields and our objects. Those aren't moving. We still have our Apex controller. That still lives in Salesforce. That's not moving. But we are going to move the UI, the view, over to the client, over to the browser. Right, so the view is going to load entirely in the browser now. And to help out with those performance issues, we're also going to add a second controller on the front end in the browser. So we're going to have a JavaScript controller in the browser now talking with our browser UI. We're going to have a JavaScript controller that, if necessary, is talking to our Apex controller, and then the Apex controller can talk to the database. So we're going to have two controllers now, possibly more, but at least two controllers, one on the front end, the client, and one on the back end, the server. And so now whenever we're making changes in our UI, we don't have to call the Salesforce server every time because we have that JavaScript controller that's loading in the browser as well and can handle a lot of things right there without having to call Salesforce. And so that's going to give us a nice performance improvement for a lot of kind of changes and clicks and things like that with our UI. Right, so we keep talking about Lightning components. And what do we mean when we say Lightning components? Right, and for the most part, kind of like with Apex, there are two flavors of Lightning components. There's Aura and there's Lightning Web Components. And when I first started developing this talk, I was originally going to go into both. But it's pretty clear at this point, if you haven't already learned Aura components, it may not be worth starting because all Aura components really are is they're Lightning Web Components with additional stuff on top of them. So you're essentially building Lightning Web Components, and then you're making them slower by doing them in Aura. So at this point, if you need to start learning a new framework, highly recommend just starting with Lightning Web Components. And any new components you may need to build, again, I'd recommend doing those in LWC instead of Aura. But all a component really is a collection of files, right? So you're familiar with the MVC model where you have a Visualforce page file, and then you have to tell it what Apex controller to work with, and the Apex controller is going to call a certain utility Apex class maybe, right? You have a bunch of files that are talking to each other. The nice thing about a component is you still have a bunch of files talking to each other, but because they're in a component bundle, they already know about each other. So you don't have to tell your UI what controller it needs to talk to. You don't have to tell your controller what CSS file it needs to talk to. Everything is wrapped up together in a component bundle. And so it automatically knows its associated files. And so with Aura, we had a bunch of different files. Lightning Web Components, same sort of thing. For both of them, we have some sort of UI file. We have some sort of JavaScript controller. We have some sort of CSS. And then with the Lightning Web Components, we're also going to have an XML metadata file. If you've been working in an IDE, you may have seen the XML files already, be familiar with them. Usually it's where you update things like the API version. We're going to be able to do a little bit more with the LWC XML files. You may already be familiar with that process anyway. So all we mean when we say component, container with multiple files. And again, we're going to be talking about LWC today and moving forward. All right, so before we talk about what's new with components, let's do a quick review of what's not changing with components. There's actually a lot in common between components and the Visualforce kind of Apex model that you're familiar with. One of them is kind of UI-based components, right? So we're still familiar with, Apex page tags, Apex input tags. And while the names of the tags are changing, the idea of using tags are not. So instead of Apex input tags, we're going to have Lightning input tags as an example. But it's still going to be a tag-based kind of markup UI. Event-based code, again, we're familiar with this, right? Trigger fires, code runs. Instead of responding to database events, we're going to be responding to browser events because we have that JavaScript controller in the front end now that's not talking to the database. But same sort of concept. Some event happens, our code is going to run. Bind variables and bind methods, that's staying the same. You're still going to see that in components. And again, the concept of multiple files being used, right? We have our Visualforce page, we have our controller, we maybe have a utility class, and now we just have all these files wrapped up into a component bundle. Right, so let's dive into these kind of specifics here. So the old framework, we saw Apex tags. In our new framework, we're going to see a couple different types of tags. We're going to see Lightning tags, like Lightning input. We're going to see standard HTML tags. So they're not even going to be specific to Salesforce necessarily anymore. They're just going to be general HTML tags that any web developer might be using. And then we're going to have tags starting with the letter C. And that refers to the default Salesforce namespace, which just means that it's going to be another component that we built. So we might have multiple components we can nest in with each other, parent component, child component, and we'll reference those child components using a tag starting with the letter C. Event-based code, again, you're familiar with this already. Triggers: before insert event happens, you fire some code. After update event happens, you fire some code. Because we're working with the front end now in the browser, we're not necessarily listening for database events. We're going to be listening for things like a value changes or the user clicks somewhere. So things that are happening in the browser, we're going to want code to respond to in our front end controller, so we don't have to call Salesforce every single time. So same sort of concept. Some event happens, and we're going to launch a controller method to handle that. Bind variables, not much is new there. We're taking away the exclamation point, but same thing otherwise, right? You reference some sort of variable in the UI, and it calls that variable, references that variable in your controller. Methods, same sort of thing. The only difference now is we have two different places where we can call methods. So we can still call our front-end controller methods from our front-end UI. This is similar to how you do it in Visualforce. We can also call our Apex controller methods from our front-end controller. And we're going to see in a little bit that we can give those any name we want. So we're going to basically say, hey, we want to use some Apex method, and we're going to give it a name just like you would a variable. But same sort of concept, calling methods from various places. The last thing, again, that's not changing is this concept of using multiple files to build something. So before we had a Visualforce page, we had an Apex controller, maybe we had an Apex helper, maybe we had multiple Apex extensions, right? But it's a bunch of files that are talking to each other. And that's going to stay the same here. We're going to have an HTML file as a UI. We're going to have a front-end JavaScript controller. We're going to have a back-end Apex controller. And maybe we're going to have an XML file or a CSS file thrown in there too. But the notion of using multiple files isn't really anything new if you think about it. All right, so let's do a comparison here between Visualforce and Lightning Web Components, just to kind of show the difference. And so I have some components up here. One is called a Hello VF. And so I want to say Hello Kitchener. And so I have to type this in this text box here. I have to click an update button. I have to wait a second, and then I see here Hello Kitchener. And that's all fine and good. But what if I want to do it a little bit faster? I don't want to have to click a button, and I don't want to have to call Apex to do it. Well, I can do that here also in my Lightning Web component. Automatically updates, and there's no Apex involved at all in this component. Let's go take a look at the code for that. Right? The code itself is actually pretty straightforward, but it's actually pretty powerful in what we can do with it. So first, our Visualforce, right? Just a basic hello world.page file here. Right? We tell our Visualforce page what controller we want to talk to because it doesn't know. And then we just have some standard tags, Apex output text, Apex input text. So we had our kind of greeting on the top, and then we had an input where we typed in the greeting. And then we have a button as well that'll update the value. So our button is telling us, hey, we want to re-render our output value when we click the button. And the value is just going to be our hello greeting. And then the value of our input, again, is going to be the greeting. And our Apex is pretty simple, but we do need it. We're just going to have a getter and setter for greeting. And that's our Visualforce page. With the LWC, though, again, it's pretty simple, but we're not going to have any Apex involved. So we're going to get some performance improvements there. Again, we're going to see some kind of standard tags here. So we're going to see a standard HTML paragraph tag. We're going to see a Lightning input tag. Again, instead of Apex input, we have Lightning input now. The same sort of things otherwise. Again, we see hello greeting, referencing our greeting variable. We see the input has a value of greeting. And now we see that we're responding to one of those UI browser events. in this case, our value is changing. So on change, when our value changes, we want to call a method to handle that change. So we're going to call a handle change method. And this is what our JavaScript controller is going to look like. Again, it's pretty straightforward. First thing we're going to see here is we're importing something. So if you're familiar with Java, you might be familiar with importing different libraries in Java. So basically, we're taking functionality that exists elsewhere, and we're bringing it in for us to be able to use. And we're doing the same thing here in Lightning Web Components. So we're going to import from the Lightning Web Component namespace a couple of things here. And then we're going to export it out, right? This is just part of the standard syntax like you have in an Apex controller, public, whatever, class name. Same sort of thing here. Export default class name, extends Lightning element. You're going to see it in all your Lightning Web Components, right? So import and export, just part of the standard LWC syntax. The next thing we see here, we see our greeting variable. We originally set it to world. So that's why it said hello world initially. And then we have this annotation on it. Similar to how you see @future annotations in your Apex, we're going to annotate things in our JavaScript controller as well. And this annotation specifically is called a decorator. And it allows us to decorate our variable with a property that gives it some extra juice. And so in this case, @track is going to be one of 3 decorators we're talking about today. @track is going to do 2 things. Number 1, it's going to make the variable private. And number 2, it's going to give us the ability to automatically re-render it when it changes. So this says, hey, whenever the greeting variable changes, automatically update it on the UI. So you saw our paragraph tag that said hello greeting. Because greeting is being tracked, our component is listening for changes in greeting. And whenever greeting changes, you saw as I was typing, that value was changing in the output text. So we have our greeting variable hello world. How is greeting actually getting assigned? Well, if you remember, we had our onChange event calling this handle change method. And all handle change is going to do is essentially, handle change is just essentially going to take whatever event caused it to fire, similar to how we have trigger.new in our trigger. We have the values that caused it to fire. And we're going to get the value out of the event that caused it to fire. So changing the input component caused this event to fire. We're going to get the value out of the input component, and we're going to assign it to greeting. So when I'm typing in that input text box, whatever that value is gets assigned to greeting. Because greeting is tracked, it automatically updates on the UI. So that's our whole component. Again, you see here, no Apex involved at all. All right, so what did we see in this demo here? We saw component markup. Again, these Lightning input texts that we're familiar with. We saw code running based on events. So in our case, on change, right? When a value changed in the UI, we caused some code to fire. We saw variable and method bindings that you're already familiar with in Visualforce. We didn't have to tell our hello world HTML file that it needed to use a hello world.js controller because it's part of the bundle. And we saw no Apex involved at all in our Lightning Web Component. All right, so let's get into kind of why Lightning Web Components are a thing and why we should care about them. So if you remember toward the beginning, we talked about this developer journey Salesforce was on, right? We started with Visualforce, we went to Aura, and then a couple years after Aura, we went right to LWC. And so when Aura was being developed back in 2014, the web kind of looked like this. And don't worry too much about all the words in the green and orange boxes, but focus more on kind of the scale here. So you can see there's a lot of green. And this is the stuff that was being done by JavaScript frameworks. The orange at the bottom is stuff that was being done by the web kind of browser standards. And in 2014, the frameworks were pretty heavy and the browser was pretty light. But if you fast forward to 2019, that balance shifted. And so now the web standards are actually pretty robust and are handling a lot of stuff on their own. And so the frameworks are able to take advantage of that. So the frameworks today are pretty lightweight. And so Salesforce came out with this Aura framework that was kind of heavy. It was doing a lot of stuff. But because the web standards are so powerful now, Salesforce can take advantage of a lot of that standardization and pull back and just have a smaller layer for Lightning Web Components. And we see that's exactly what they did. So they took all this stuff they were doing before on the left side, in the middle there in the OR programming model, and they let the web handle it in our Lightning Web Component model. So they still have some stuff on the top. They still have like the Lightning input tags and some base components like that. They still have the Salesforce security. They still have something called the Lightning Data Service. But they're taking advantage of a lot of web browser standards now, very similar to a lot of other frameworks. And so that's kind of the reason why Lightning Web Components became a thing shortly after Aura. Right, so we talked about what's old, what's not changing with web components. Talk about some of the new stuff that we can get excited about and start taking advantage of as we grow our own developer careers. And one of those is those industry standards. So I mentioned that part of the reason LWC framework is a thing is to take advantage of all these standards. Well, not only is Salesforce trying to take advantage of standards, but they've joined a bunch of standards boards to help influence future standards. So now when the web kind of framework, the web standards are developing, Salesforce is going to have a say in how that goes. And that's good for two reasons. It's good for you as a developer, because that means all the work you're doing on Salesforce now with Lightning Web Components, you can use a lot of it for doing non-Salesforce work, right? We've seen JavaScript, HTML, and CSS are some of the most popular languages out there. They're being used all over the place. And so if you want, as you're growing your developer career, you can expand beyond Salesforce or take on some projects that are maybe off-platform. The other good thing about it is it allows Salesforce to expand their reach. So now they can reach out to all of these thousands and millions of developers that are using these front-end languages and say, hey, come on to Salesforce. A lot of the stuff you're doing is the exact same thing here. We're going to add a little bit of stuff to it, but you're going to be able to hit the ground running without having too much knowledge of the platform. So that also means your friend that maybe was a web developer not using Salesforce can start using Salesforce as well. So I think very exciting all around. The next thing we see with LWC is this notion of all the logic being in one spot. So you're probably familiar with in Visualforce, you could throw anything into a curly bracket bang expression and Visualforce would evaluate it, right? So we could have, okay, the value equals curly bracket bang, this text plus this variable plus this other text, right? And Visualforce would say, all right, we're going to combine all that and then display it. And that's a pretty clear violation of the MVC kind of framework guidelines. And so that's all gone now. So anything you need to calculate and evaluate, that's going to be done in your controller. And the UI is just specifically going to be for a UI. You're going to do the variable calculation in your controller, and then you're going to display the variable in your UI. Getting back to kind of the core of what MVC is supposed to be about. This is one thing I'm very excited about, multiple Apex controllers. So with your Visualforce page, you're limited to, you have controllers and controllers extensions. But for the most part, you're limited to one controller. And you have to tell it what controller you want to use kind of at the beginning. And you're kind of limited in what you're able to add on top of that. And with the Lightning Web Component model, you can now have as many controllers as you want. So that's why I like to call it MVC++. So you can have one Apex controller, you can have two Apex controllers, you can have as many as you want. We're going to see an example of that in a little bit. And then the last thing we're going to talk about that's new today is those decorators. So we saw one already in @track, and we're going to see two more in a little bit. And again, these give your variables some extra properties that come in very handy when we're using them throughout our components. All right, so let's get into an LWC demo here, a couple demos actually. And all this code will be made available to you after, so don't worry too much about copying it line for line, but focus on the concepts of what's happening and some of the new stuff that we're talking about. All right. So the first demo I wanted to go over is this component called LDS Create Record. LDS just stands for Lightning Data Service. And so component itself is relatively basic. I have an ID thing here that's disabled, a name thing I can type into, name input I can type into, and a button. So I'm going to type in a name here. Let's say Kitchener. I'm going to click Create Account. And I'm going to see, great, my account was created. I see an ID, ends in ZSVIAA. If I go over to my accounts, I see it was in fact created, Kitchener, and I see ZSVIAA, so that matches. So that's where that account is. This component, by the way, is not using any Apex, and we'll see how it's doing that in a minute here. We also see, so I get my ID back here. If I start changing this in any way, that ID goes away. Maybe now we have a different account called kitchen we want to create. And so we lost that reference to that ID. And we also see this information down here. It says we can create a record without writing any server-side code. Gives us a link called view source, and that view source is going to launch a GitHub repo that has the code for this component, and that's going to a page ending in LDS create record. We'll see why that's important in a second. All right, so that's our create record component. Let's go take a look at the code for it. All right, so here's our LDS create record HTML page. This is our UI. First thing we see is this template tag. So this is a standard HTML tag, just like in Visualforce, all your components start with Apex page. In LWC, all your components are going to start with template. And then we get into a couple of standard base components. So just like we have our Apex input tags, we have our Lightning input tags, and then we have a Lightning button tag. So we see two inputs, one for ID, one for name, and a button for create account. And again, we're responding to UI events. So our name input needs to respond when it changes. So whenever our value that we typed in changes, we want to call a method called handle name change. And whenever our button is clicked, we're going to have another event called onClick. And we want to call a method called create account to actually run the process of creating our account. And the other thing we see here is this C tag. And remember I mentioned we can bring in kind of additional components we built. So we have a component here called view source. Salesforce's default namespace is called C. If you're an ISV, you might have a different namespace in your org, but the default one is C. So this means we have a component called view source in the default namespace. And if you remember in our link, we saw our GitHub link ended in LDS create record. It's actually coming from here. Just like we can pass in variables to methods in Apex, we can pass in variables to components in LWC. And so we have a source variable in our view source component, and we're giving it the value LDS create record. And if you look at our view source component real quick, the view source component is actually pretty simple. It's using all default HTML tags. And it has an A tag, which if you're not familiar with HTML, just means it's a hyperlink. And the link it goes to is in this href property. So href references a variable called source URL. And remember, we gave it a value called source, right? So we had a value called a variable called source we passed a value into. And here they're referencing a variable called source URL. And if we all look at the controller here, we're going to see there's a base URL that's linking to a GitHub repo. We see our variable we passed into source, and we can do that because it has another decorator at API. At API is going to be very similar to at track. The only difference is at API makes it a public variable, so we can pass values into it from other components. And again, at API is going to allow our value to re-render when it changes. That part's not as relevant here, but API allows us to pass a value into this component. And then we see we have a getter for our source URL. And again, we're doing all of our logic in the controller now. So our source URL is going to be the base URL plus the source we passed in. So we see this GitHub repo, and then it ends in LDS create record. And this allows us to use this view source component in all of our other components, looking to different places in our GitHub repo. Let's jump back to our create record component though, right? Remember we had our two browser events we were responding to, onChange and onClick. So onChange is going to call handle name change, and onClick is going to call create account. And so if we jump into the JavaScript for here, the JavaScript controller, we see we're importing a lot of different things this time. Again, we're importing from LWC, but we're also going to import from another Salesforce namespace. And so you can look up all the things you can import from different places in LWC. But two of them are going to be from the Lightning namespace. One of them is that toast you saw when the record got created. So we have a toast event. And the other one is going to be from the UI record API. So this is the Lightning data service that allows us to do some things without having to actually use Apex. So we're importing from our UI record API. We're going to call that functionality create record in line 3. And we're going to use that a little bit later on. We then see we're going to import something else, again, using our default C namespace. We have a component called LDS utils, and we're going to import that custom component we've built into our component here as well. So we can import from custom components. And lastly, we can import here from our database, from our schema. And so here we're importing from our account object, and we're importing from our name field on the account object. And there was actually a specific reason we do this. We could, if we wanted to, just directly reference account and account.name. But let's say this was a custom object and a custom field. Right? You're probably familiar with having fields in a bunch of different Apex classes. And when you try to change the API name, it's a pain because it says, sorry, this field is referenced everywhere. And you're kind of out of luck if you want to change it. And so by doing it this way, we're able to have LWC talk to our schema. And LWCs are metadata aware, meaning that if I go change the API name of something, because I'm importing it and giving it another name, my LWC will automatically update with whatever API name I gave it. So as long as I'm referencing it the same way, I can still import my account object as account_object, and whatever the API name is, we can go worry about it later. But we're just going to reference it as account_object. Right, so we can import from a bunch of different places. Again, we see our account ID is being tracked, so if it changes, it's going to re-render in the UI. And again, we see we have a method here for when our input changes for handle name change. And handle name change does two things. One, it's going to reset account ID. So that's why you saw when I deleted some text in that input box, our ID went away because it was changed and it's being tracked. And again, just like in our other component, we're going to get our name field based on the value of the event that fired this method, meaning that whenever I change the value in that input box, it's going to be assigned to the name variable. And if I look a little bit lower in my component here, remember those three things we imported at the beginning, the create record from our record API and our account object and name field. We have a method here called create account when we click our button. And our button is going to say, hey, whatever the name field's API name happens to be at the moment, let's go grab that. Whatever our account object's API name happens to be now, let's go grab that, put them in some variables. And then that create record we imported from up above as well, we're going to call that, and that's actually going to use the Salesforce Lightning Data Service to create our account record. It's going to generate an ID. We're going to assign that ID to our account ID variable, and because it's tracked, that's what allows our account ID to show up in the UI after the account's been created. And then you see we're going to fire off our toast event as well that we also imported. All right. So that's all our create account method. Let's go take a look at one other method here, or one other component. And this method is going to be called Apex wire method to property. And so we're actually going to be using Apex. You remember the last two components we saw had no Apex. We're going to be using some Apex in this one. And we're going to see we have the contacts and the list of contacts and our opportunities and a list of opportunities. And then again, we're going to see this view source component. And here our view source is going to link to a page talking about Apex wire method to property. Well, let's go take a look at what this code is doing here as well. And this code component is actually going to be pretty simple. The HTML is going to have a couple things on it. Again, we see our template tag that starts all of our web components. And then we're going to have a conditional statement in our HTML. So we have this block that says if true. And if true, again, works just like an Apex if statement. We're just checking to see if this value has any data. So here we see our bind syntax we're familiar with. We have some sort of context variable, and we're looking for a property called data. So if our context has anything in our data property, we want to run this block. We have a for loop similar to an Apex repeat, similar to an Apex, a for loop in Apex. For each value in context.data, we're going to call it contact, and we're going to display contact.name. And then down below here, if we have anything in our context error property, again, we're going to call a custom component called error panel using our C namespace syntax. And again, we're going to use an @API property called errors that we're going to pass in context.error. And the same thing here for opportunities. So we're checking to see, does opportunities.data have any value? If it does, we're going to display our opportunity name and opportunity amount. And if not, we're going to send it to our error panel. All right, so we have a variable called contacts and a variable called opportunities. How are these being set? And this is our entire JavaScript controller. So again, we're importing from LWC, and we see two new things we're importing from get contact list and get op list. And Grant, I see your question. We can address that at the end. We'll have some time for Q&A as well. So here we're importing from Apex. So we have one Apex controller, contact controller, and a method called get contact list. We're going to give it a name to reference it. We're just going to call it get contact list. And then we see a second Apex controller here. So now we're using opportunity controller, a method called get op list. And again, we're going to reference that as get op list. And then down here, we see our third decorator we're talking about today at wire. And that wire is going to do a couple things. One, it's going to allow you to wire up an Apex method to your variable. And it's going to give the variable two properties, .data and .error. So .data is going to be whatever gets returned from your Apex method. If something went wrong with your Apex method, that's going to get stored in .error. So here we see we're wiring get contact list to a variable called contacts. We're at wiring get op list to a variable called opportunities. And so now we have our contacts and opportunities. And if you look at the Apex, it's pretty simple. We're just calling some SOQL queries in contact and opportunity. We have an annotation here at Aura enabled that lets us use it in our components. We have another property, cacheable equals true, that allows us to use it with wire. So that's going to cache the data to make it easier and, again, give us a performance improvement. And then if we go back to our HTML page again, right now we know how contacts and contacts.data is getting populated. It's getting populated with the return from our SOQL query, so a list of contacts. If anything is in that list of contacts, we want to display them. For each contact, we want to display the contact name. And if there are any errors, we send it to error, our error panel, and then the same thing for opportunities. So if there's anything in opportunities.data, we're going to display our opportunity name and our opportunity amount. So that allows us to talk to Apex and send it back to our Lightning Web Components. All right, so what do we see in these demos here? Again, we saw component markup, right? We saw our Lightning input tags, our Lightning button tags, some HTML tags. We saw variable and method bindings we're familiar with. We saw our three decorators, at track, at API, and at wire. And we saw we can import from almost anywhere. We can import from LWC. We can import from the Lightning namespace. We can import custom components. We can import from Apex. We can import from our object fields and names as well. All right, so that's all great. A lot of new stuff, a lot of old stuff. Where do we go from here? So we talked about how web development is already pretty popular. So if you haven't already started getting into front-end development, I highly recommend doing so. We've seen that Salesforce has evolved to meet demands. So as the web has changed, Salesforce has adapted to that. We saw some similarities between the front end and the back end with our Visualforce. We saw some new stuff, and we saw that this is really the way that Salesforce and the web and software development is moving forward. And again, this is just step one kind of on our journey with web components. So if we're taking the next steps here, I have some links. And again, I think this presentation will be shared with you all. But you can find base components in the component library. So things like Lightning input. And again, it gives documentation, just like in Visualforce, about how to use it, gives you some code samples, things like that. There's even a link in there to go play around with some components. There's a sample gallery on Trailhead that has a lot of already created apps that give you code to start playing around with yourself. There's the LWC .dev website that Salesforce kind of has a bunch of additional information on events and other things like that related to Lightning Web Components. There's a trail mix with some information on getting started with Lightning Components. And the Salesforce instructor that teaches the Lightning Web Components course also put some additional resources together as well. And you can find that at bit.ly/aura2lwc. So that's in terms of step 2. What I highly recommend also for step 3 is taking a look at the Lightning Design System if you haven't already. And you can get there at lightningdesignsystem.com. It's abbreviated SLDS, but basically this is a bunch of kind of already created CSS. So other than also learning CSS and figuring out how all that works and positioning all your components, the Lightning Design System is going to have a lot of that built in for you. So it's going to give you padding, margins, allow you to reposition things, maybe center things within your component, things like borders. It's also going to give you a bunch of icons and utilities. So it'll let you drop in accordion, for example. It'll let you drop in a progress bar, for example. It'll let you bring in a bunch of different icons. And you don't have to figure out how to code that all for yourself. You can just use the already built Lightning Design System classes and include those with your components. So I highly recommend checking that out as well. Right, and so with that, again, I'm Adam Olshansky. I see we have a couple questions in the chat here, but happy to take any existing ones as well. All right, so let me go back to the chat here.
Yes.
And where did I do it?
I can read out the questions we have in the chat window.
Okay.
So the first question came from Grant. I saw in one of the example you started with one template and then you have a nested template, right? So the question is why we want to use multiple template tags.
Why would you want to use multiple template tags? So again, that is, and I don't actually know the specifics between template and Lightning card. Template is kind of a standard HTML tag. And so it's kind of like how you have Apex page block and then Apex page block sections. It just helps you kind of differentiate your section within a section. And so one nice thing about LWC as well is you don't have to put in Salesforce every time you search for anything. You can just search for names as they are. And so if we look at the template tag here, it'll give you some more information about exactly what it does. Okay, so content inside a template tag will not be rendered. So it looks like it might have something to do with, that wouldn't make sense actually. Let's see, template if a code you want to use over and over, but not until you ask for it. Okay, so it looks like it has something to do with how HTML works. I'm not exactly sure about the specifics of that tag.
Mm-hmm.
So I would have to go look more into that. But again, this, for the most part, I took from, where was it? I took from the components that are built, and that's kind of how it was in there. But happy to help you follow up on that as well.
Yep.
But I don't know the specific reasons.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the next question came from Avi. Where is the data and the error properties defined?
Yeah, so where are data and error defined? So that is part of the @wire decorator. That's part of what it gives the variables. So remember we talked about @track is going to make it private with re-rendering. @API will make it public and re-rendering. @wire will wire it to the method, and @wire is going to give your variable a .data and .error property. That's just part of the @wire decorator. So by annotating these with @wire, that's automatically going to give contacts a .data and a .error property.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Let's see if I can find that real quick. Understand the wire service. Okay, yeah. So if you look up @wire, it probably may have some more details about that as well. Okay, yeah. So if a function is decorated with @wire, the results will return in an object with a data property and an error property. And these are hard-coded in the API. You must use these values. So no exceptions there, apparently.
That's awesome. Okay. Next question from Raju is a session recording shared. Yeah, this session is being recorded, and I'll share the recording and the deck later tonight. Thank you.
Any other questions?
No, we don't have any other question here, but I have one question here. So you told like we have to use the Lightning design system. So if you open one of the component that you have created, right? How can I start writing like how can I start using the Lightning Web Component in the or Lightning design system in the Lightning Web Component?
How can I start using Lightning Design System in the Lightning Web Component? So it depends kind of what you want to do, right? So if I go to this Lightning Design System website here, I might have there's a bunch of different things you can do with it. So it'll give you examples on giving things margins. So let's say you want a little extra space above or below or to the left or the right of a component. Essentially, you'll take your component. You might give it, let me see some component code here. Okay, so yeah, you might have, for example, in this component here, you see there's a div around it with a class defined.
Got it.
And the class is specified as LDSM around medium. So I think M stands for margin. So if I go down here, I should find somewhere LDSM around medium, horizontal, vertical, around. Okay. And so that class is going to essentially give you spacing all around the component. And so if I go look at my create account now, I think you can see kind of some white space on the left here. You see some white space on the bottom. You see some white space on the right, and you see some white space on top. So that white space is all coming about as a result of including this class here.
Okay, I got it. And the top tag should be in the template. That's how we have to start.
Yes.
Okay. So one last question I have before we finish that one, like, what about like if I need to create my own kind of padding or one own kind of CSS style, right?
Yeah. So there you can add I don't remember if I did this here. I closed out of Visual Studio. But you can add a CSS class to your component if you do know how to use CSS and want to add your own outside of this. But again, you're going to have to kind of build that from scratch. But you can, if you have specific IDs of your components, you can give it your own CSS as well.
Okay, that's good then. Okay. So we are not limited to Lightning Design System only. We can use our own styling as well.
Correct. Yeah. So Lightning Design System basically makes it so that you don't have to figure out what the CSS is to do this. They're going to give you a class that's going to do it for you. But if you do want to get more granular, you just right-click on the bundle and add, for example, if it's called LDS Create Record, you just add LDS Create Record.css, and you can add any CSS you want to it.
That's awesome. Perfect. I think we have one here. That question came from Deepak. What is the best practice we have to follow to import multiple S-object fields into a JS controller?
Best practice for importing multiple fields into a JS controller. So multiple fields. Where did that go? No, that was in this one. Okay. So I think the best practice, to my knowledge, is to import them all individually, again, so we can track them all separate and give them separate names. So if I want to import 10 different fields, I can just put 10 import statements here. And that way I can track them separately. You saw in our code here, when we were referencing each field, we were getting the API name kind of at runtime. So that way we can track them all separately.
Yep, that makes sense. Good. I don't think we have any more question here. Yep, thanks. I don't think we have any more question here. So again, thank you, Adam. Yeah, I think this is definitely helpful. And I'm going to share the recording and the deck with the audience. I'm going to actually publish that in the event section, so that everybody will get that auto email like with the recording and the deck slide. But again, thank you, Adam, so much. It's really helpful. I'm 100% sure like the people will be really benefited from this event.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. If anyone, feel free to reach out if you have any more questions. And thanks for having me, Sudipta.
Thank you so much, and have a nice day, guys.
Okay, take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.